Edward Sinclair drove down the narrow road that wound along the coast, the early morning sky painted in pale pinks and soft blues. He had not come back to this town in more than a decade. For most people, it was just a sleepy place by the sea. For Edward, it was the place he had once called home, the place he had lost everything he cared about. He parked his black sedan outside a small cafe that looked almost the same as it had when he was a boy. Weathered boards and a faded sign, swaying in the breeze, gave it a quiet charm. He walked in as though he belonged anywhere, his expensive suit and polished shoes contrasting with the humble setting. Inside, warm light spilled over wooden tables and wicker chairs. A few regulars sat with morning coffee, their voices low and content. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air. Edward paused by the door, taking it all in. He remembered the sound of waves just beyond the window, the seagulls crying overhead, and the laughter he once shared with his little girl at a corner table near the window. He closed his eyes for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. It had been 10 years since she vanished. 10 years since the accident that woke him in the middle of the night with news that no parent should ever hear. He moved to the counter and sat on a high stool. His assistant would have frowned at his choice of a small cafe over the marble boardroom table. But Edward did not care about business today. He only cared about one thing, and he did not yet understand what it might mean. A waitress with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail approached him with a bright smile. She wore a simple blue uniform and carried a notepad, but she treated every customer as if they were the most important person in the morning. Edward watched how she set a plate of warm croissants on a table nearby, how she spoke softly to an elderly man who seemed to be a regular. She had grace and kindness in every movement. When she turned to him, Edward forced himself to meet her eyes and clear his throat. "Black coffee, please," he said, his voice steady even though his heart pounded like a drum. She nodded and moved to pour from a large pot behind the counter. Edward allowed himself to focus on the ambient sounds, the hiss of the coffee machine, the quiet murmur of conversation, the soft scrape of chairs as someone sat down. He breathed in the rich aroma and let it calm him. He could feel the ghost of his daughter's laughter echoing in the space between the tables. "Here you go," the waitress said, setting a steaming cup in front of him. Edward reached out to take it and froze. He had been about to raise the cup to his lips when his eyes drifted to her forearm. There, etched in pale pink against her skin, was a long scar. It began near her elbow, ran down her arm, and disappeared beneath her sleeve. The shape and placement were impossible to ignore. Edward's breath caught. His mind flickered back to the night of the crash. The day the doctor had shown him his daughter's scar and explained how they had stitched her arm after the rescue. That scar had been his proof that she had survived the wreck. And then the chaos, the wrong address, the missing ambulance record, and the silence that followed. He stared at the scar as if it were a bridge leading back to the past. His hand trembled so slightly that the cup wobbled on its saucer. The waitress looked at him, concern flickering in her dark eyes. Edward quickly covered his cup with both hands, pretending to adjust his cufflinks. He tried to speak, but no words came. She leaned forward a little, curious. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked softly. He blinked and forced a small smile. "Yes, thank you," he said, and he reached for the cup as if to drink. The steam rose in a gentle swirl between them. Edward took a careful sip, closing his eyes for a moment. The coffee was just right, bold, smooth, with a hint of bitterness. He inhaled deeply and tried to calm the storm inside him. He was the man who had built a business empire from nothing. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals and charm world leaders. But here in this cafe, faced with that scar, he felt small and unsteady. He finished his coffee in 3 more careful sips, pretending to study the coarse wood grain of the counter. He kept his gaze low so he would not seem rude, but also so he could stare at the scar without the waitress noticing. When the cup was empty, he dropped a few crisp bills on the saucer and stood.
Ow.
He was about to leave when the waitress bent to pick up the cup, and her ponytail slipped free from its band. A single strand of hair brushed her cheek, and Edward saw more. He saw the soft curve of a familiar nose, the way her lips pressed together when she concentrated, the gentle strength in her shoulders. Wondered how 15 years could change someone so much and yet leave a scar unchanged. He felt a rush of hope so fierce it nearly overwhelmed him. He tapped a finger on the counter and waited until she noticed. "Excuse me," he said quietly. She paused mid-step, wiping her hands on her apron. "Do you know someone named Lily Sinclair?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. She blinked, surprise lighting up her face. The cafe door opened behind her as a breeze swept in, carrying the salt scent of the sea. For a moment, Edward felt himself drift away from the marble boardrooms and private jets, back to the living room of the small house he had left behind. He saw his daughter Lily curled up in his lap as he told her stories beneath the lamplight. The waitress pursed her lips. "I don't think so," she said slowly. "Who is she?" Edward reached into his coat pocket with deliberate slowness. He pulled out a photograph, yellowed around the edges, showing a little girl with bright green eyes and brown hair, her arm bandaged and her laugh frozen in mid-joy. He held it out to the waitress, his fingers brushing the corner of the image. "This is my daughter," he said. "She disappeared 10 years ago after an accident." The photograph trembled slightly in his hand. The waitress took a step back, her eyes widening as she recognized the face she had tried so hard to forget. She swallowed, her own breath catching. Edward watched her, his heart hammering. He had come here seeking an answer he almost dared not hope for. The entire cafe seemed to fall silent around them, the other customers oblivious to the moment that was about to change to lives forever. He waited, offering no more words, letting the photograph speak. Outside, the waves rolled in against the sand, as though urging the truth to come forth. The light through the window glinted on the scar on the waitress's arm, tying past and present together in a single line. Edward felt tears prick at his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He would not break now, not after carrying the weight of uncertainty for so long. The waitress stared at the photograph for a long moment, then at the scar on her arm, and back at Edward's earnest face. Memories flashed behind her eyes, fragments of pain and love, of a father's voice and a child's laughter. She stepped forward slowly as though drawn by an invisible thread. Edward stood perfectly still, both of them caught in a web of hope and fear. Then at last, she reached out and touched a photograph. Her fingertips brushed the girl's smiling face. Edward exhaled a breath he did not realize he'd been holding. He did not speak until she did. "My name is Ava," she whispered. I think I remember her." He nodded, tears finally slipping down his cheeks. He closed the distance between them and gently held her hand, guiding it to the scar. Ava's breath hitched as she let her hand rest there. Their eyes met, and in that moment, every lonely year, every unanswered question, every silent night without his daughter came rushing back. The cafe around them seemed to blur, the other voices a distant hum. All that mattered was the scar and the photograph and the man and woman, who now stood facing one another as father and daughter. Outside, the sky climbed higher, and the sea continued its endless journey to the shore. Inside, Edward and Ava began to bridge the 10 years that had separated them, taking the first small steps toward a reunion neither had dared to believe could ever happen. Edward Sinclair could barely sleep that night. Images of the scarred forearm and the photograph filled his mind like a movie on endless loop. He paced his spacious mansion in the city, the walls lined with awards and photos of his achievements, but none of it mattered now. All he could think about was the possibility that Lily might still be alive. He leaned over his mahogany desk, rubbing his temples, and made a decision. Tomorrow, he would return to the seaside town and the little cafe where he had first seen her. He needed to learn more. The next morning, he arrived just as the sky turned pale gold. He parked his sedan a block away, lowering himself into the driver's seat, as if bracing for what might come next. He watched the cafe door open and close through dark-tinted windows. A few regulars strolled in, greeted by the friendly chime of the bell above the door. Edward held his breath, waiting for the sight of her dark ponytail swaying as she greeted customers. When she appeared radiant in simple blue uniform and apron, His heart thumped in his chest. He practiced calmness as he walked inside. The cafe smelled of baking bread and roasted coffee beans. Soft chatter rose around him. He chose a corner table so he could watch without being obvious. He ordered a plain roll and more coffee. The waitress appeared almost immediately, as if she had sensed his need. She placed the roll on his plate with a polite smile. Edward paid, slipped a few extra bills into the tip jar, and settled in. As he ate, he studied her every move. She moved effortlessly between tables, her back straight, her eyes warm. She listened carefully when an older man told her about his wife's fall, and she reassured him with a gentle voice. She handed a group of teenagers their hot chocolate, teasing them about whipped cream mustaches. In every action, Edward saw kindness and strength. His mind flicked back to memories of Lily's laughter and bright spirit. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, and when he opened them again, she was walking toward him. "More coffee?" she asked, holding the pot in one hand. Edward nodded. When she poured, her wrist turned slightly, showing the scar again. It felt like a jolt of electricity. He watched the pale line where skin had healed, but never forgotten the injury beneath. He reached out and touched the cup. "Thank you," he said softly. He tried to smile casually, but his heart was racing so fast he thought she might hear it. She gave a small nod and moved on. Edward leaned back in his chair, pretending to read a newspaper spread across the table. But he really watched her through the top corner of his eyes. She stopped at a table to help change a chair for a customer who had a broken leg. She lifted the chair gently, her muscles taut beneath her uniform, and carried it with care. Wondered how many times she had lifted heavy trays or carried boxes into the cafe's storeroom. She seemed to shoulder every task with quiet determination. Edward returned 3 more times that day. Each time he sat, he ordered something small and studied her life. He wanted to know every detail. He watched how she tied her hair back before her shift, how she wiped down tables with quick, practiced motions, and how she paused by the window to watch the sea. He noted the friendship she had with the cafe's owner, a kindly woman named Mara, who gave her advice on dealing with tricky customers. He saw the warmth in their relationship and realized how much this little corner of the world meant to her. Late that afternoon, Edward rented a small apartment above a bookstore a few streets away. It gave him a base where he could stay hidden in plain sight. He unpacked one suitcase and left the rest in storage. He took out a laptop and searched public records. He found a few mentions of Ava Carter, the name on the cafe's staff roster. No criminal record, no news articles, nothing unusual. He searched for birth announcements and found a listing for an Ava Sinclair, born 10 years earlier in this very town. It matched the time frame of his daughter's disappearance. His pulse quickened. He printed the birth record and placed it next to the photo of the little girl in his study. He compared the handwriting on his copies of the police report to the document from the town hall. The dates matched. Lily had been born here, but the certificate showed her surname as Carter, not Sinclair. He frowned and thought of the grandmother. Who must have adopted her? He realized she must have changed her name to protect Ava from painful questions or angry relatives. He felt a surge of relief that someone cared enough to protect her, and a fresh wave of sorrow for the years they had lost. The next morning, Edward walked slowly to the cafe. He paused outside and inhaled the salty air. He remembered taking Lily's hand as they walked along the shore, building sandcastles and collecting shells. He remembered her excited smile when she found a heart-shaped stone. All those memories had seemed to vanish like footprints in the sand. Now they were coming back in vivid detail. He entered the cafe and saw her behind the counter, chatting with Mara about new pastries. He overheard Mara ask about Ava's plans for the weekend, and Ava replied that she intended to visit her grandmother for dinner. His stomach twisted. He did not want to scare her away by appearing too eager. He seated himself at a table at the back and waited. He thought about how to begin a conversation without frightening her. He did not want to rush her or pressure her. He wanted her to feel safe. He took out a small leather notebook and wrote down questions, practicing different ways to ask them. What memories did she have of her childhood? Did she remember any places that had meaning to her? What had her grandmother told her about her parents? He scribbled, erased, and rewrote. When she brought him the coffee, he tried one of his practiced lines. "I'm new in town," he said. "Do you have any favorite spots around here?" She smiled and recommended a bookstore, a bakery, and the old pier at sunset. Edward thanked her and asked if she could point them out on a map. She nodded and took out a map from behind the counter. As she pointed to roads and landmarks, Edward leaned forward to study her face, the scar hidden by the sleeve of her uniform. He felt a knot in his stomach tighten as he realized he was risking being discovered before he was ready. He decided to change strategy. Later that day, he sent a message to Mara, the cafe owner. Under the guise of a local historian researching the town's past, he asked for any old photos or stories about families who had lived here. He used a different name, careful not to reveal who he really was. He hoped Mara would send him photos or documents that might shed light on Ava's past and maybe the reason she had changed her name. That evening, Edward returned to his apartment and opened his laptop. He waited for a reply. While he waited, he looked through the photos he had taken of Ava in the cafe, her laugh with the teenager, her careful steps with the elderly man, her momentary glance at the sea. He realized he was deeply moved by every small gesture. He felt a bond growing between them that went beyond father and daughter, a bond of admiration and respect. At 9 o'clock, his phone pinged. Mara had replied. She attached to old photographs, one of a young couple holding a baby in front of the same cafe, and another of a little girl standing by the shore clutching a seashell. Edward's breath hitched. The woman in the photo was Ava's grandmother, and the man beside her was her grandfather. The baby in the picture had Lily's bright green eyes. The little girl on the shore had Ava's scarred arm wrapped in a bandage. Edward stared at the pictures until his eyes blurred. He printed them out and placed them next to the birth record and his photograph of Lily. They formed a puzzle that fit together perfectly. Ava Carter was Lily Sinclair. The evidence was undeniable. But Edward knew better than to approach her too soon. He needed to be patient and careful. He would wait for the right moment, a moment where she would not feel trapped or frightened. He would let her find the truth at her own pace. The next morning, Edward prepared one more message to store in his notebook, but something stopped him. He folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. He realized he no longer needed scripts or practiced lines. He trusted his own voice now, a voice shaped by a father's love and years of regret. He would speak to her from the heart. With that decision, he left the apartment and walked toward the cafe. The sun rose higher, casting a warm glow on the town as if urging him forward. Edward took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. He was ready for whatever came next. He would speak to Ava Carter without disguise, reveal his identity, and ask for her trust. And he vowed to listen to her story, to learn how she had survived and what she had become. The days of quiet observation were over. It was time for truth, asked ChatGPT. Edward woke early, the pale light of dawn filtering through the thin curtains of his rented apartment. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped together, heart pounding. Today he would speak to Ava Carter without pretense. He let the small rules he had set aside pretending to be a historian, hiding behind maps, fall away. He needed honesty, the kind that might scare her, but could also heal them both. He dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, clothes that would not make him stand out as a businessman. He wanted to look like someone who belonged in the town, not a stranger on a mission. He left the apartment with a single photograph in his pocket, the picture of Lily with her bandaged arm. I walked the block to the cafe, each step echoing memories of the past. He remembered bringing little Lily here on weekends, watching her run between tables, her laughter lifting the mood of every soul in the room. When he arrived, the cafe was quiet. A few early birds sipped tea in the corner, saw Ava behind the counter, setting out fresh pastries. She moved with the same grace he had watched the day he first met her. He took a deep breath, stepped inside, and took a seat at his usual table by the window. He placed the photograph face down on the table to catch her attention. Ava emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. She paused when she saw Edward. His simple clothes, calm expression, and the photograph waiting for her seemed to confuse her. She straightened her posture and approached him. He began, then closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them and spoke slowly. Ava, or Lily if you prefer. I'm sorry to surprise you. She frowned uncertainty. Flickering in her eyes, he held out the photograph. This is you. I know it's hard to believe, but I think you are my daughter. Ava's breath caught. She blinked, looked at him, then at the photograph. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. She studied her own face as a child, bright eyes, a small bruise on her forehead, the bandaged arm. She had buried the warmth of a father's hug, the sound of bedtime stories, the sting of the accident. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not let them fall. I don't understand, she whispered. My name is Ava Carter. That photo was never shown to me. Her voice cracked. Edward nodded gently. I know someone cared for you, your grandmother, he said softly. She gave you her name to protect you after the accident. He paused. Gathering courage? I'm Edward Sinclair. I lost my daughter Lily the night of the accident. I searched everywhere, but the trail went cold. He swallowed, then added, and then I saw your scar. Ava covered her mouth with one hand, pulling the other sleeve down to hide the scar. Shame and hope struggled inside her. I don't know, she said. My grandmother told me my parents died in that crash. I know, Edward replied. I was told the same. Records show you survived. I've seen the birth certificate with your name, Ava Sinclair. Then I saw this photograph sent by your grandmother. I saw the scar on your arm. I had to know. Looked down at the photograph, then back at him. Why now? She asked. Why come after so long? He leaned forward, voice gentle. Because I saw you by chance, and I could not unsee the scar. Every day since, I have wondered if you were my daughter. Could not risk another day without knowing the truth. Ava closed her eyes. She remembered the accident, the screech of tires, the blast of air, the world turning dark. She remembered waking up in a hospital, her arm bandaged, no family beside her. A social worker had taken her to her grandmother's house, where she was told her parents had died. She had grown up never asking too many questions, afraid of the answers. Now, the answers had found her. I'm scared, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I am without her. She nodded toward the photograph. Who I am without Lily. Edward's heart ached. You are my daughter, he said simply. Lily Sinclair will always be Lily, no matter what name you use. Are the same brave little girl I held in my arms. Tears slipped down Ava's cheeks. She let the photograph fall to the table. She reached for his hand across the tabletop. His skin was warm and rough from years of work. Not the soft touch she remembered. But his presence felt right. He stood and knelt beside her chair, keeping his hand on hers. He whispered, It's okay to cry. She did not resist. The tears flow, hot and cleansing. He rested his forehead against hers, sharing her sorrow. After a long moment, Ava wiped her eyes. She looked around the cafe at the regulars, who were now watching with gentle curiosity, but saying nothing. She felt exposed, the truth laid bare in a room full of strangers. Edward squeezed her hand. You belong to me, he said. I belong to you. We will face this together. She gave a small, uncertain smile. I don't know what to do next. He rose and offered his hand to help her up. We'll figure that out, he said. Let's start with you coming to my house for dinner tonight. Just us and your grandmother. No fancy suits or business talk. Just a family meal. Ava hesitated, then took his hand. He helped her stand. No. She brushed a tear from her cheek and nodded. Okay, she said softly. He paid for their coffees and led her outside. The sun shone brightly and the sea breeze felt fresh. He walked beside her without, rushing, letting her set the pace. She glanced at him, and for the first time in years, she felt hope. At the apartment above the bookstore, Edward had left a note for her grandmother with directions and a promise. Please join us at 6. We need to speak honestly. He stepped aside as Ava read the note, then said, I know this is a lot. You don't have to decide everything now. Just know I'm here. She looked up at him, eyes shining with tears and relief. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, then gave her space to return the note to her pocket. They stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe, two figures tied by a shared past. Ava looked at her scar, then at Edward's face, etched with lines of worry and love. She felt a warmth in her chest, a bond stronger than any fear. "I will come," she said at last. "For dinner?" Edward smiled, a smile that broke through years of sorrow. "I'll pick you up at 6. She watched him walk away, then turned to face the town she had always called home. Memories floated around her like driftwood on the tide. Childhood, laughter, the accident, years of wondering. Now the tide had changed. She was no longer alone. Edward walked back to the cafe door and paused. He closed his eyes, pressed a hand to his chest, and listened to the quiet hum of life inside. He felt relief and excitement all at once. He had found his daughter, and she was safe. Inside, he saw Ava return to her duties, her back straighter, her eyes brighter. She moved through the cafe with renewed purpose. He watched for a moment, then turned and walked away, ready to plan their reunion. That night, he would prepare a table with her favorite foods: seafood chowder, lemon cake, and fresh fruit dishes. He remembered cooking for her when she was small. He would set out her favorite music and light a candle. He would wait with hope and an open heart for Lily Sinclair to come home. Edward drove the short distance to his old family home, a low brick building with tall windows and a small porch where he had once tucked Lily into a swing. He parked under the oak tree, its branches heavy with green leaves, and took a deep breath. In his pocket was a folded note for Ava's grandmother, with simple words: "Thank you for raising my daughter. Tonight we come together as family." He smoothed his shirt and went to the front door. Ava's grandmother, Mrs. Carter, opened it before he could knock. She wore a soft cardigan and held herself stiffly, as though bracing for a storm. Edward offered her a small, respectful bow. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Her eyes were solemn, her lips pressed into a thin line. She invited him in without a word. The living room smelled of fresh flowers and old books. Family photographs lined the mantel images of Mrs. Carter's own children, Ava as a toddler, and then blank frames where Lily's picture might have hung. Edward felt a pang of regret, but he reminded himself that tonight was for healing. He followed Mrs. Carter through the hallway into the dining room. A round table stood in the center, set with plain white plates and sturdy silverware. Soft yellow light glowed from a single lamp in the corner. Ava sat at the table, hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple dress with small flowers, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. When she saw Edward, her eyes widened. She stood and met him halfway. He offered her a gentle smile, and she gave a small, shy one in return. Mrs. Carter took a seat at the head of the table without invitation, her face calm but unreadable. Edward pulled out a chair and sat beside Ava. The edge of the table felt cold, but the warmth in the room came from the hope he felt. He looked at Ava first. "Thank you for trusting me enough to come," he said. She nodded, her eyes shy. Then he turned to Mrs. Carter. "Thank you for raising Ava as your own. I know she has been safe because of your love." Mrs. Carter's eyes softened. She pressed her lips together, then reached into her lap for a small envelope. She placed it on the table before Edward. "I want you to have this," she said. Edward opened it and found a faded letter written in a careful hand. It was from the social worker who had cared for Lily after the accident. The letter explained how Mrs. Carter had stepped forward, claiming Lily as her granddaughter, and how she had changed the girl's name to protect her from media attention. It spoke of the fear and the compassion that followed the crash. Edward read the letter slowly, his heart heavy with gratitude and sorrow. When he looked up, tears glistened in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. He folded the letter and set it beside the photograph of Lily. Ava watched him, her own eyes filling. Edward reached across the table and took Ava's hand. Her fingers were slender, warm, and familiar. They walked together through a simple dinner: seafood chowder, steamed vegetables, and apple pie. The food tasted like memories of better times, but everyone ate quietly at first, each caught in their own thoughts. Mrs. Carter broke the silence by clearing her throat. "I wanted to protect her," she said softly.
After the accident?
The police said her parents were gone. The press was swarming. I was afraid she would be taken away from me. Ava listened, her gaze steady on her grandmother. Edward watched their faces. He understood now the weight of decisions made out of love. He reached for Mrs. Carter's hand and rested it on the table. "You saved her life," he said, "and you loved her when I could not be there." Tears ran down Mrs. Carter's cheeks. She let out a shaky breath. "I could not let her be alone," she said. "She needed someone." Ava slipped out of her chair and knelt beside her grandmother. She hugged her tight, and Mrs. Carter returned the embrace. Edward watched them, feeling a warmth spread in his chest he had not felt in years. Ava rose and walked to the window, looking out at the dark sky. Edward excused himself and stood beside her. The porch light shone on the oak tree where he had watched Lily swing when she was small. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said. "I thought I had lost you." Ava turned and looked at him. Her eyes were soft but strong. "I grew up safe," she said, "but I always wondered why I could not remember you." Edward swallowed. The apology caught in his throat. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I will spend the rest of my life making up for it," he said. "I promise." She nodded and leaned into his hand. Behind them, Mrs. Carter watched from the dining room door, her face a mix of relief and peace. The three of them stood there, quiet as the night, linked by the scars of time and love. They returned to the table and finished the meal. Edward poured tea for each of them. As they sipped, he told stories of the empire he had built, how he had started with nothing and built a business that spanned continents. He spoke of travels he had taken, the people he had met, and the awards he had won. But as he spoke, his voice changed. He told them about the charity he had funded for missing children, a project born from his own loss. He described each life he hoped to help, each family he hoped to reunite. Ava leaned forward, eyes shining. "You did that for me," she said. Edward nodded. "I did." Mrs. Carter reached for Ava's hand. "We are proud of you," she said. "But tonight, we are a family again." Ava swallowed and wiped her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "A family." They spent the rest of the evening sharing photographs and memories. Mrs. Carter showed Edward old albums, pictures of Ava as a baby, of all the birthdays she had missed, the holidays they had spent together. Edward saw his daughter smile. In every frame, he felt tears of joy this time, tears that spoke of second chances. When the clock struck 10, Edward stood. "I will take my daughter home tomorrow," he said, "to stay with me if she wishes." Ava looked at him, hope and fear mingling in her gaze. He stepped closer and knelt before her. "I will give you all the time you need," he promised. "No rush, no pressure." She reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for tonight. I have missed you." He lifted her hand to his lips. "I've missed you more." He looked at Mrs. Carter, who nodded. The grandmother gave Edward a small smile that glowed with relief. They walked together to the front door. Outside, the wind rustled the oak leaves. The air smelled of salt and promise. Edward closed the door. Behind them, and they stood on the porch, Ava slipped her hand into Edward's. Mrs. Carter stood beside them, her face calm and content. In the soft glow of the porch light, father, daughter, and grandmother formed a single line of love and hope. They looked out at the oak tree, the same tree that had witnessed Lily's childhood laughter. Tonight it bore witness to a reunion 10 years in the making. Edward raised his hand and brushed a tear from Ava's cheek. She smiled, the scar on her arm hidden by her sleeve but remembered by every heart in that moment. The three of them stood there, ready to walk forward together, toward a future built on truth, trust, and the bonds of family rediscovered. ChatGPT said. Edward woke the next morning before sunrise, light just creeping over the horizon. Dressed quietly in jeans and a soft sweater, something he hoped felt more like home than a businessman's suit. His heart raced with a mix of excitement and nerves as he grabbed his keys and phone. Today would be the first day he shared his life with Lily, the daughter he had lost and found. He parked in front of the grand estate he had built years ago, but had not inhabited with warmth until now. He stared at the tall windows and ornate doors imagining Lily's laughter filling the halls. Lily stepped out of the car in a simple blouse and jeans, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked nervous, but determined, holding a small bag with a few personal items. Edward opened the car door and helped her out gently. He smiled as she took in the view of the manicured lawns and blooming rose bushes that lined the stone path. "Welcome home," he said softly. She gave a small nod, her eyes bright with tears. They walked up the path side by side. Edward reached for Lily's hand, and she slipped her fingers into his. He led her inside, pausing in the foyer to let her take it all in. The room was large, with high ceilings, a grand chandelier, and walls. Lined with family photos, Edward guided her to a picture of her as a child, standing beside him on a sandy beach. He knelt beside her and pointed to the photo. "It was us 10 years ago," he said. "I want us to make new memories together." Lily studied the photo, touching the frame. She smiled gently. "It feels like a dream," she whispered. Edward stood and took her hand, leading her through the hall to a bright room at the back of the house. Sunlight poured through French, doors that opened onto a garden. He had prepared this room for her: a soft bed with flowered sheets, a small desk by the window and on the nightstand. The old music box he had saved from the accident. He set the box on the table. "This is for you," he said. "I thought you might want to have something familiar." Lily picked up the music box and wound its key. Soft melody played, the same tune she had loved as a little girl. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she held the box close. Edward knelt beside her and offered a tissue. "You can stay here as long as you want," he said. "This is your home now." She looked around the room, then back at him. "Thank you," she said. I don't know what to say." Hugged her gently, careful not to startle her. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just be here." Later, they walked through the garden, the morning sun warming their backs. Lily paused by a rose bush with pink blossoms. "These are my favorite," she said softly. Edward had remembered. He bought 2 dozen for her grandmother that night, but these were from his garden. He knelt and cut a bloom, handing it to Lily. She held it close to her heart. They spent the morning helping in the estate's little charity office. Edward introduced Lily to his team people, who had worked with him to find missing children and support families in need. Each person greeted her with kindness, calling her Miss Sinclair, before Edward quietly corrected them with a smile. "Please call her Lily," he said. Lily blushed but shook hands with the team, feeling the warmth of community. One of the staff, a gentlewoman named Rosa, showed Lily a photo wall of children who had been reunited with their families. Lily pointed to one photo of a boy hugging his mother and said, "That could have been me." Edward squeezed her hand and nodded. He had named the project Lily's Hope after her, even before he believed she was alive. He led Lily to a blank spot on the wall, framed and ready. "This will be your place," he said. Lily's eyes widened, and she nodded, tears of gratitude in her gaze. By midday, they left the office and walked to the kitchen, where a simple lunch awaited: sandwiches, fresh fruit, and lemonade. Edward and Lily sat at a sunlit table, sharing stories. She told him about life with her grandmother, about school, her love for painting, and how she had always felt the pull of the sea. Listened with awe, realizing how much he had missed and how strong she had become. He shared stories of his travels, of deals made in distant cities, but he also told her about the nights he spent staring at her old bedroom wall, hoping she might come home. Lily reached across the table and touched his hand. "I'm here now," she said. After lunch, Edward drove Lily to the beach where he had once brought her as a child. He parked at the same small lot and walked down the familiar path. Salt air filled their lungs, and the waves crashed softly on the shore. Lily kicked off her shoes and walked barefoot on the cool sand. Edward followed, his heart full. They collected shells, built a small sand castle together, and laughed as a wave washed over their toes. Lily's laughter was like a balm on Edward's soul. As the sun began to dip, Edward led Lily to a beachside bench where a picnic blanket was spread with snacks and 2 cups of hot chocolate. She sat and leaned against him as the sky turned pink and gold. Edward wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I have something for you," he said, handing her a simple silver necklace with a small shell pendant. So you can always carry the sea with you. Lily touched the pendant, her eyes shining. It's beautiful, she whispered. They stayed until the stars appeared, then walked back to the car, hand in hand. Edward drove her back to the estate, and Lily paused at her door. She turned to him. Thank you for today, she said. It was perfect. Edward smiled and hugged her. Tomorrow we have many more days ahead, he said, and I can't wait. Lily went inside, and Edward watched her through the open door as she closed the music box and set it on her nightstand. He stood in the foyer for a moment, feeling a peace he had not known in years. He walked to the study and retrieved a journal he had kept since the accident, when Lily had been lost. He opened it and wrote a single sentence. She is home. That night, Edward called his mother, who lived in another city. The news his daughter was alive. His mother wept with joy on the other end of the line. Edward smiled through his own tears. Tomorrow, they would call his sister and his father, and they would all welcome Lily back into the family. Before he went to sleep, Edward stood in Lily's doorway and watched her sleeping peacefully. He knelt and kissed her forehead. Good night, Lily, he whispered. I love you. Lily stirred and smiled in her sleep. Edward closed the door gently and walked to his own room, heart light and hopeful. In the days that followed, father and daughter explored the town together. They visited the bookstore where Edward had stayed, laughed with the cafe owner Mara, and shared a meal with Mrs. Carter in her cozy home. They shopped for a painting easel for Lily, and Edward helped her set it up in a bright corner of the UHR house. He watched as she painted a seascape, her brush moving with ease and passion. Every evening they sat by the fireplace, Lily reading aloud from her favorite stories, Edward listening with pride and love. They talked about the future, about Lily's dreams of being an artist, Edward's plans to expand the charity work in her name, the new family they would build together. One afternoon, Edward surprised Lily with a trip to the city. They drove through busy streets to a small art gallery where her painting hung in the window for a charity show. Lily's eyes widened as she saw her work displayed. People gathered to admire the bold colors and gentle lines. Edward stood beside her, holding her hand. Your art will help other children, he said. Lily smiled and squeezed his hand. On the way home, Lily leaned her head on Edward's shoulder in the car. Thank you for everything, she said softly. Edward kissed the top of her head. Thank you for coming home, he replied. That night, they sat under the stars in the garden, sharing a blanket and hot tea. Lily rested her head on Edward's shoulder. He held her close, the scar on her arm hidden but remembered with every beat of his heart. They were family again, bound by love, trust, and the promise of tomorrow. And as the stars shone above, Edward and Lily looked ahead to many more mornings like this, mornings of simple joy, shared laughter, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter who had finally come home.